The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and civil rights. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they've been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Ted Shaw, the Director Counsel of the Legal Defense and Education Fund. One thing we know, Ted, is here it is 2006. The King holiday was approved in 1986. That's 20 years. King was assassinated in 1968. That's 38 years. As we reflect back, and as you and the Legal Defense Fund and the African American community reflects on this, what is your reaction to King Holiday 2006?
Well, first, it's always good to be with you, and I just was reflecting on 20 years because, like you, I'm sure, I remember when we were
fighting for
advocating for this holiday. But even back then, you'll remember that many of us were concerned that it would just become another day, like, you know, President's Day.
A shopping day.
Shopping day, right. And people would be having Martin Luther King Day sales and things like that. And we thought what was important about King's holiday was not a day off from work, but rather a time for reflection and rededication and recommitment to the struggles on behalf of African Americans, people of color, against racial discrimination, against sexism, against all kinds of isms, and of course the struggle for economic justice in this country. So I still think about the King holiday in that way. It's a day that I don't think of as a day off from work, and in fact, I'm blessed because my work is related to the work of Dr. King's life. So it's a day in which I usually spend some time reading some of his writings and works to reflect upon that, and then I go to some kind of gathering or speak somewhere or do something like that. And I think all Americans ought to reflect on this day about the issues he was concerned about: militarism, poverty, racism, sexism. These issues are still with us, and so I hope that's what we use today for, to reflect on those issues and rededicate ourselves.
The other part of this is, as you reflect, you really go back to what the world was like in 1968, in 1964, voting rights, in 1955. I happen to be one of those who lived in segregated America. I was a Tuskegee Airman in the segregated Air Force. I fought for the Brown case decision with your predecessors. I was a expert witness in the Supreme Court case to eliminate public discrimination, public recreation. So I and people of my generation have a real solid understanding of the racism in this country and the impact of segregation and how far we have struggled to have the first black federal judge, William Hastie, to
That's
have
right.
the first black cabinet officer, Robert Weaver, who, interestingly enough, a graduate of my high school, Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C.
A great high school.
A great high school. And a lot of great people came from there because it showed that African Americans had the ability, when given the opportunities, to succeed. But at the same time, while we were making those strides in Montgomery, Alabama, and making those strides with the Voting Rights Act in '65, still this country was mired in racism. The question of, well, what do black folks want? How should they get it? And King was beginning to give life to that. The Poor Preachers March, he was pointing up that 35% of black folks were poor, pointing up they were still being segregated, even though it was illegal. And because he was getting closer to the truth, he was assassinated. Now, it's true he wasn't assassinated by any particular party. He was assassinated because of a spirit of mind where James Earl Ray happened to be the trigger behind that spirit. So when we think back on that King holiday, we have to understand what it really meant. And then it took us 18 years to get the King holiday. People say, we don't need another holiday. Of course, this is the only holiday that's dedicated to black Americans.
And, well, tragically, though, I think that people think about the holiday as a black holiday. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that we ought to be proud that an African American is honored with a a holiday. On the other hand, this ought to be a holiday for all Americans. And when I say a holiday, I mean in
It'll
the
be called Liberty
original
Day.
sense. Well,
Freedom Day.
Freedom Day or something like that. But, you know, a day that, as I said earlier, we use for reflection and rededication and recommitment. You know, when Dr. King was assassinated, you'll remember that he was in Memphis, and he was there to advocate on behalf of garbage workers. I think about the recent strike of transit workers here in New York. And there was an article in the New York Times, but we didn't need that article to tell us what we were smelling already, which was that the issue of race was lurking around that transit strike, that people were engaging in rhetoric that was suggestive of their race biases. So I thought about Martin Luther King then. Because whatever the merits of a transit strike might be, whether it was legal, illegal, or whatever, Dr. King, when he was in Memphis, was committing himself to the kind of people who were advocating for decent wages, you know, fair wages, for employment fairness. And those struggles go on today. They're still with us. When you talk about 2006, it's hard to believe that we're this far through the first decade of the 21st century already, but we are.
And 25% of African Americans live below the poverty line.
That's
the
exactly
average
right.
income of African American families is 63% of white Americans. That's the blot on this country.
That's right.
With all of the Oprah Winfrey's and the Stanley O'Neills.
Tremendous progress, but at the same time, we still have so many people who have been untouched by that progress, sometimes relatively speaking, sometimes absolutely. And to have somebody like you talk about the long sweep of your lifetime, and you know the progress we've made, but also when
know
you
the
say
progress
that,
we haven't made.
Exactly, exactly.
Now, one thing that's beginning to be discussed, it's really an African American discussion. What are the middle class and upper middle class black folks doing to advance the cause? Because many times some middle class blacks are embarrassed by the behaviors of some lower income blacks. They're concerned that they aren't getting ahead because they don't have the necessities, as Al Campana said, or that they're not acting right. I happen to totally disagree with that. I think that the struggle of the poor is the struggle of the middle class, and the more we divide, the less we're going to make progress. What's your view on that?
Well, you know, we could spend a whole show and then some on this issue. It wouldn't be nearly enough time. And I was thinking about the controversy surrounding Bill Cosby's comments on the Brown anniversary. And, you know, I was right there.
You were there.
And took the stage after Dr. Cosby. And I disagreed with some of the substance of what he said, and I disagreed with the tone in which he said it. Having said that, the underlying impulse that motivated Dr. Cosby to say what he said, I think, is something that we discuss all the time within the African American community. And I don't believe that it's a question simply of class. I think that there are things that we have to address within the African American communities that we can't point the finger at anybody else for. And it's important that we have those discussions. What I was concerned about, what I still am concerned about, was that Dr. Cosby's comments were going to be hijacked, as they were, by people on the far right and used and distorted in ways
it's
that...
It's our fault that we have this
That's right.
condition.
That's right.
Now, Bob,
and so I think this is an important issue that we have to address at the same time as we continue to address the fact that there are still there's still racism. There's still systemic problems with respect to race and class that we all know existed. So Katrina for us wasn't a revelation. It was an illumination of what we already knew existed. And I believe that, again, that was the work of Dr. King, and it's what he would be committed to today. He'd also be talking about Iraq and militarism.
Definitely would.
But he'd be talking about the issues that were exposed by Katrina.
Now, Bob Herbert, writing in the New York Times op-ed a week or so ago, said that he felt there was a lack of leadership of the black community, black leaders.
Yes.
And that basically black leaders need to come together to begin to address these the behavioral context in which some of the negative behaviors occur. That's really easier said than done, because we have many factors that tend to project behaviors that we aren't particularly interested in. School doesn't count. Getting good grades is acting white. Talking trash is a way to live. How can black leaders, and you're one of them, confront this? I know that you can't make the instant answer, but give some reflection on what black leadership, which would include myself as well, can begin to do to address some of these dysfunctional behaviors such as teenage pregnancy, violence, drug use, and the like.
Well, I don't know how much I can do on those issues. Certainly I have a little bit of a bully pulpit because of the position I hold, and I certainly should use that in every way I can to address these issues. And when I go out and speak to, as I did recently, young black men and males, and and I've done it many times, my message is that whatever your relationship with a woman may be, when you bring a child into this world, you have a solemn obligation, a responsibility to raise that child, and that's not only financially but spiritually. And that's something that we need to continue to say. But we need to do more than that. Look, I'm a civil rights lawyer. That's what I do best. That's what I know. And I don't pretend that the work that I do is the whole answer. On the other hand, I do think that we collectively, all of us, the people who are civil rights leaders, as well as people who are the grassroots folks in the communities, we all have an obligation to address these issues. Bob Herbert's piece was very powerful, and he has the credibility to write the piece he did because Bob also speaks out against racial injustice when he sees it. I think all of us have the obligation to work both against racial injustice that's visited on the African American community from without, and we also have an obligation to take care of our internal problems.
What about the idea of just saying in our own community to our own people, this is not acceptable?
Absolutely. I mean, but look, I believe that we say that in many instances.
Enough.
Well, perhaps we can never say it enough when there's unacceptable behavior, but we have to do it more, and we have to be more deliberate about it. The idea, though, that the head of the NAACP and the head of the Urban League and the head of the Legal Defense Fund and these other organizations have it within their power to solve all these problems, I think is misplaced. It doesn't mean we don't have a role, but I think collectively we've all got to address these issues. Look, one of the things about Dr. King's life is that after he was killed, I think that he was turned into this icon.
This nonviolent
icon. This nonviolent icon, dreamer, and conservatives now quote him.
Yeah.
A lot of black folks say, well, where's the next Martin Luther King coming from? We are leaderless because we don't have a Martin Luther King. Well, you know what? We have an obligation to be leaders, all of us.
Every one of us.
Every one of us. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And he was an extraordinary man in an extraordinary time, but there were a lot of extraordinary people in that extraordinary time. Because, that I've seen and you've seen, I'm sure, that oppression breeds character. Not that we want oppression. But I think that we have a lot of extraordinary people these days. Maybe it's not as evident how extraordinary they are because conditions aren't as extreme as they were before. But we all have an obligation.
One thing we have to confront is that the communications channels are different now than they were during King's time. It was radio, television, African American press.
Yes.
Now we have hip hop, we have music, we have entertainment of various types, and some people too easily discount the value of those particular modalities in addressing our folks. And I think people like Kanye West and so on who really tried to talk about that in their music. And I think that's important for us who speak in different approaches to deal with that. That's something that you and I and others really need to take seriously, and I know that you do. But going back to the Legal Defense Fund, you guys' job is to and I shouldn't say guys, I said your collective rainbow, male, female, Asian, Latino group of attorneys have a responsibility to build on those openings that Martin Luther King established. What are you doing now? I know you've got 100 cases, but what are the specific things that you're working on now that you think King would be very proud of if he were alive?
Well, you know, the last volume of Taylor Branch's majestic 3-volume work on the life and times of Martin Luther King has just been published. It's called At Canaan's Edge.
And a review in the Time magazine.
I haven't caught up with it, but I'm sure it's
with quotes, which are now being quoted all over the country.
I picked up the book, started reading it, but it starts out with the Voting Rights Act and Selma. And the Voting Rights Act, as you know, is up for reauthorization or expiration in part right now. Mm-hmm. We're working very hard on reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. We are also working on the issue of judicial appointments. We have the nomination of the second justice to the Supreme Court this year. Actually, not this year, but within a year. We've now crossed over into 2006. Samuel Alito, the Legal Defense Fund, is opposing his nomination because we believe it's important to have judges whose votes are in play, and we think his record on the Court of Appeals demonstrates that for the most part, with some exceptions, but for the most part, his vote hasn't been in play very much in cases involving race discrimination claims on behalf of African Americans and others. We are litigating the issue of felon disfranchisement here in New York State. We are in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals awaiting a decision there. We are litigating issues involving employment discrimination. We're still fighting for equity in education, and we'll continue to do so. There is an all-out assault on any scholarship programs and pipeline programs for African American and other students of color that we are fighting against, because our adversaries say that those programs are comparable to, or they constitute racial discrimination. That's nonsense. They are in no way comparable to the kind of discrimination visited upon African Americans. They're not based on the notion anybody's inferior or superior. They're trying to continue to open the doors for people who historically have been discriminated against and underrepresented. There are so many issues on our plate. Capital punishment is an issue that the Legal Defense Fund's been dedicated to throughout our existence. So at the Legal Defense Fund, we say, if you think the struggle is over, think again. We're not fighting de jure segregation. The target isn't as clear and as easy for many people to see. Mm-hmm. But anybody with eyes to see and ears to listen knows that we don't live in a world where the playing field is even, that race is still an issue. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Katrina exposed that for a moment. And people want to rush back into denial and into complacency. But we know that there's still a lot of work to be done, and we're thankful for all those who support us, because we'll continue to do this work as long as we have the breath to do it.
Well, part of the thrust of what I call the silent racism is that it's projected to white Americans that they have it made. And therefore, any new group, blacks, Latinos, immigrants, are going to take away from them. And that is so patently false, given the many, many contributions, scientific, cultural, education, economic, that these groups make to the society. How do we get across to the white community that they don't have it made and that their struggle is our struggle, or our struggle is their struggle?
Well, again, you know, keeping in the theme of the King holiday, one of the things Dr. King talked about often was how we were all joined together. Mm-hmm. He said, woven together in this inescapable garment of destiny, or something, words to that effect. What happens to African Americans and to the African American community affects all Americans, and what happens to Latino Americans affects all Americans, and Asian Americans, Native Americans, white Americans, poor people, etc. We are all living in one nation, and I don't believe any of us are going to be secure and safe if we have large portions of the population who have no reason to consider themselves part of our society. They're not getting anything out of it. They're being left behind. If we want people to buy in We have to include all people in all of the good things, all of the benefits of the society we have. And I also think it's important for us to look beyond the shores of the United States and think of our role and our place in the world community. And we certainly have a lot of work to do to improve our standing in the world community right now. This is a blessed country in so many ways, but it's a terrible mistake to be complacent. You know, I often think about the words of Albert Camus, who said, I would like to be able to say that I love justice and love my country too. That's what we want for the United States. And on the King holiday, that's what we should be working for, and every day.
You know, a metaphor for what can be done when people come together, it's probably the only metaphor that brings this country together, is sports. Because of the fact there's so much variation in race and nationality and religion in sports, somehow or another, maybe Super Bowl day is our day when we look at the American dream as a real dream. Now, we know it's an economic holiday, but the fact is that to penetrate people who have such deep-seated prejudice and deep-seated feelings of superiority, sometimes I feel like saying to white people that I meet who are prejudiced, walk in my skin, live in my skin. And in a sense, that's what King was trying to do when he gave those very fine metaphorical sermons about moving together. Yeah. And that's why I think he was dangerous to the establishment.
Well, you know, first I hope that that Super Bowl Sunday isn't the only day that we can look forward to, because I'd be happy to get through that day with a good game and no wardrobe malfunction. But the truth of the matter is that you're right that people tend to think about sports and sports figures differently. So people admire, you know, Michael Jordan.
Muhammad Ali, the greatest athlete.
Well, there's an incredible example of somebody who really stood against the system and was hated and reviled in his time, who now has become a hero for all Americans, just like Martin Luther King, safely dead. You would think that most Americans marched with him or supported him, and it simply wasn't true. And in fact, the truth of the matter is there were many black people who opposed Martin Luther King and who said vicious things about him, who conveniently forget that these days. You know, when you stand and struggle, you're standing in the middle of a storm and a controversy, and you're not going to please everybody. So, you know, we tend to soften memories as time goes by. But I do believe that that these days that most white Americans, I choose to believe this, I hope this is right, most white Americans really do want to do the right thing about race on some level. Now, whether they really understand the nature of racism today, how it's not the brutal racism of the 50s, and we have institutional racism, we have inertia, we have all these inequities, and whether they really want to address these issues, that's another thing. But I saw the reaction to Katrina, and across this country, people really cared about what happened. They were outraged by what happened there. You know, for a moment, they saw race and poverty as a problem that it is throughout this country. And the issue is whether we will continue to keep our eyes open, or because it's uncomfortable, because it's convenient, whether we'll close our eyes. And we do that at our own peril.
Young people, that's our future. Young people don't totally understand the message and the contribution of King. What can we do to bring this more alive to them?
Yeah. Well, you know, this is an ahistorical country, across the board, everybody. You know, what happened 40 years ago might as well have happened in the Jurassic age. That's right. So that's a problem. And we all need to, I think, understand our past to understand our present. Having said all that, I have great hope and faith in younger people because we have to. And the truth of the matter is that those of us who are in positions of leadership in organizations, whether it's the Legal Defense Fund or the NAACP or the Urban League or PUSH or anybody else, if we do not develop a generation of people and then pass the baton on to them, we fail miserably in our responsibilities. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes it's not a matter of us passing the baton, because I think young people ought to take it, you know, when they're ready to take it. That doesn't mean that they need to do it in a way that brutalizes people who have served. But you know, every generation passes the baton, or the baton is taken from them. I know at the Legal Defense Fund we have great young dedicated lawyers. So I don't buy into this notion that the hip-hop generation is not politically conscious, aware that they somehow are falling down. Now, there are a lot of problems. There's no question about that. And there's a lot that we need to address in terms of the value structure within our communities we talked about earlier. There are a lot of messages that are out here being purveyed by some young black folks at times that are negative messages that you know, reflect badly upon women, and misogynistic messages and all of that. So there's a lot of work that we have to do, but I'm not willing to paint with a broad brush. You know, I always think about Sweet Honey in the Rock and their song dedicated to Ella Baker, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest."
And we will not rest. On Martin Luther King Day, 2006, we've been talking with Ted Shaw, Director Counsel of the Legal Defense and Education Fund, and we're projecting a message of hope and faith and struggle. Thanks for being with us today, Ted.
Thank you, Roscoe.